I would like to now introduce you to Laura Bajurny. It is my absolute pleasure to be able to do so. Laura is an expat Canadian who joined the Alcohol and Drug Foundation 4 years ago after finishing her Masters at the University of Melbourne. She is passionate about educating the community about drugs and drug use, especially through sharing stories and creating non-judgmental spaces for people to ask questions. As an information officer, she both researches and writes resources, as well as talking to people directly through the Drug Info phone line. So without further ado, please welcome Laura Bajurny. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So today we're going to focus on exactly that topic of around alcohol and other drugs, about supporting loved ones. I did want to preface this with a meme that I did not make, but I do like to use because it really captures for me the spirit of 2020. I don't need to rehash what everyone's been through. You all know what you've been going through, but it is a reminder that exactly this kind of topic is very timely, that although we're seeing lockdown restrictions ease across the country, this has taken a real toll on our collective mental health. And when we're talking about being there to support the people we care about, now I think it's even more important than ever for people to have access to the information and the resources that they need to support their family and friends. I'm just going to hop into it. I'm going to start with a really quick overview of where to get good drug information and a little bit of info about drug use in Australia. We're going to do a super brief reflection exercise and then hop into 2 stories that I've been given permission to share from a couple of individuals, which is really going to lead into me underscoring the problem of stigma around alcohol and drug use, as well as mental health. And then I'm going to finish off with that, what we can do, and making sure that I share all of those resources. So that's places like where to find more information, where to find support pathways, because one of the biggest things that I hear from our communities is that people don't have access to good information about alcohol and other drugs. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and also that people feel overwhelmed when someone comes to them and says, I need help. People don't know what to do, and it can be a little bit challenging to navigate that system. So I want to leave you all feeling a bit equipped, knowing where to get really good information and how to support people with pathways to the help that they want. This is from our Alcohol and Drug Foundation website. It's really exciting. We launched it just about a year ago, and it's actually the most up-to-date classification system that we have for drugs. So it's now split into 7 different types of drug. A drug, generally speaking, is something that you ingest into your body that alters your mood, your way of seeing the world, your perceptions. Different drugs have very different effects, which is why we find that classification systems like this are really useful. So I'm going to zoom in on just one of these slices of the pie and show you what I mean. So nitrous oxide, or NANGs, which we get a lot of questions about, falls under the category of dissociatives, which is one of the new categories that's been introduced. And you can see on the middle portion of the wheel there, part of why we like this system so much is it gives you just a really quick overview of some of the common effects of dissociatives as a category. And then it gives you examples of specific types of dissociatives that you can then click on for specific information about that one in particular. So for example, NANGs just gives you that information about nitrous oxide. The fact sheets are really accessible. They just give some quick dot point information about the drug effects, the risks, how to reduce the risks. So this is a really useful thing, not just for practitioners, but also just for the community in general, to know that they're getting solid evidence-based information about alcohol and other drugs. It's also pretty and kind of fun to just have a click around. It is very interesting, especially to see all of the new psychoactive substances that have been emerging in the past few years. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to hop on the ADF website and check out our drug wheel. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about drug use in Australia. So normally I get people to shout this out, but just think it in your minds. How many Australians do you think have tried an illicit drug, even one time, And how many Australians do you think have used an illicit drug in the past year? Okay, if you have your guesses, these stats are pulled from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey because they make very pretty pictures, and I am all about infographics. So you can see at the top there, I'm always curious to see if this aligns with people's guesses. But we know that about 43% of Australians, or 4 in 10, have tried an illicit drug at one point in their lifetime. It might have just been the one time, they might have used it more frequently than that, but 43% of people have tried some illicit drug at least once. And we know about 16.4% have done so in the past 12 months. So then across the bottom, you can see, what the most commonly used illicit drugs are. Alcohol is the most commonly used drug in Australia, but this is looking just at illicit specifically. Probably not surprising, to see that cannabis and ecstasy or MDMA are two of the most common here. And what I thought was really interesting about the survey this year too is they included that stat about why people first try drugs. And they found that the majority of people, that 69%, they first tried drugs out of curiosity. Talking a little bit about alcohol, I love this slide because we in the sector are so excited about this data that is showing, especially amongst our 18 to 24-year-olds, some pretty dramatic reductions in lifetime risky drinking. So that just means drinking that increases your chances of developing an alcohol-related disease like a cancer or a liver disease. We've seen that drop from 31% in 2001 down to just under 19% in 2019. And these are our 18 to 24-year-olds. So the kids these days are actually doing really well on this front. And we're seeing similar patterns in single occasion risky drinking or binge drinking. You probably hear it described as. So again, the reduction hasn't been quite as huge, but still really, really good progress. So this is very exciting for our sector. I will say though that the majority of Australians have consumed alcohol in the past year. And for context, on a less happy note, about 1 in 10 of recent drinkers, we estimate, do meet the criteria for having an alcohol dependence. So that's less fantastic, but still good data to have. And so I wanted to step into this imagination exercise, I suppose, where it's something that we usually bring up when we start talking about stigma. So if you could just close your eyes, proverbially or literally, and imagine a person who uses drugs. Like, what do they look like in your mind? How would you describe them? Or imagine a person who is dependent on drugs, or a person who is dependent on alcohol. Who do you think they are? Like, what do you see in your mind's eye, and what are some of the things that you would say about them, or the assumptions that you would make about that person? And we do the same thing for mental health. If you imagine people with a mental illness, or people with a mental illness who also use alcohol and other drugs. And then I want you to really critically ask yourself, where did you learn that? Where did you get those ideas about people who use drugs, people who experience an alcohol or a drug dependence, what kinds of people they are? Everyone's probably going to have at least somewhat of a different image, but there are a lot of stereotypes about people who use drugs, and especially people who experience a dependence on them. And sometimes it's not until we really critically reflect on where we got those stereotypes that we realize that a lot of it, for most of us, and guilty before I entered the sector, it comes from TV, it comes from movies, and it comes from media reporting and media personalities. And those aren't often fabulous sources for information. And it's often not until we really start to critically reflect on where we developed these stereotypes that we're able to analyze those biases and to start to step past them and really be driven a lot more by empathy and empathetic thinking, and recognizing that everyone is an individual, that we can start to move past those stereotypes. So I also like to remind people that no one takes a drug to feel worse. Sometimes people find themselves in situations where they might be taking a drug to feel normal if they're experiencing a dependence on it, or they might be taking a drug to not experience withdrawal symptoms if they're dependent, or they might be taking a drug to cope with stress or anxiety or for fun. No one takes drugs to feel worse. And from there, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I was really grateful that these two individuals agreed for me to share pieces of their story. I do want to emphasize these are pieces of a story. This is the quickest snapshot of a life. But I wanted to start with Tessa. She's in her late 20s. She now works in a professional capacity, and she describes herself as coming from a totally average middle-class home. Her parents didn't use drugs, to her knowledge. If they did, she never knew about it. And they weren't big drinkers. They weren't like wine with dinner every night. So drinking would normally be special occasions, when they had family over, when it was someone's birthday, that kind of thing. You know, she never really saw her parents intoxicated. Alcohol and drugs weren't a feature really in the home. Now, she remembers having her first drink around 14. Some of her older cousins gave her alcohol because they thought it was fun. And then as she was a teenager, she engaged in binge drinking fairly frequently. She was a member of kind of that party high school clique. So she did drink pretty regularly as a teen. But then as she transitioned into hospitality, maintained that a bit, as there was very much a culture of like going out for after work drinks. But then when she moved into a professional capacity and a lot of the people around her changed their drinking behaviors, she hasn't. And these are a couple of things that Tessa wanted to share. So she drinks about a bottle of wine every night, which is not ideal from a health perspective. And it also contributes to some anxiety and some depression that she's been experiencing, especially recently. She does recognize that the alcohol contributes especially to the anxiety, but she talks about it being a double-edged sword, where when she's drinking in that moment, she feels better, and it makes it challenging for her to then think to the future and how much worse it's going to be the next day. She talks a little bit about not, you know, she's usually hungover. She holds down her job. She's doing well at work, but she's certainly not giving it her all, to use her own words. And she says that when she tries to stop, and she has tried to stop a couple of times, she always finds a reason to go back to it. You know, I've had a hard day, or I deserve it, or whatever, you only live once. So she always has that voice rationalizing why she should continue drinking. She expresses that she doesn't want to cut it out. She just wants to cut back to feel more in control of it. And really tellingly, I asked her specifically why, because she's never been to formal treatment, and she doesn't want to talk to her doctor about it. And she says it's because she is afraid, because she wants to be a parent, that she'll be judged and that people will look at her for having a self-described problem with alcohol, and they'll think that she won't be a good mom, or that she shouldn't be a mom, and that they'll judge her on that basis. The other person that I wanted to touch on quickly has a pretty different life trajectory, because Tessa doesn't, she doesn't have a history of trauma or a history of, you know, heavy alcohol use in the family. For her, it's been more individual and driven by her peer group. Whereas Billy had a much different upbringing. His mom had a lot of pretty serious mental health issues. She was in and out of hospitals for the majority of his life, and had her own prescription drug-related problems, which really left a bad taste in his mouth about trusting the medical profession, especially trusting psychiatrists, which makes it very difficult to try to convince someone to get involved with treatment when they have an inherent mistrust of the profession. This is a little bit about what Billy has to say about himself. He actually came to alcohol and drug use pretty late, you know, into his 20s. And he recognizes that he has these patterns that alcohol and drug use do contribute to, where he'll have months of feeling on top of the world and really happy and really energetic. And those are typically his periods of really intensive drug use. Now, the drug he's used has been different across the course of his life. Sometimes it's been cannabis, sometimes it's been alcohol, sometimes it's been cocaine, sometimes it's been a mix of those. But he'll normally have a really intensive period of use, followed by a big crash, a depressive episode where he will then stop taking drugs because, in his words, he says, doesn't feel like it's worth it. It's not even fun for him. So for him right now, he's not using any drugs. He doesn't feel like it, but he also recognizes that that's been a pattern in his life, that alcohol and drug use has contributed to that cyclical mental health issue, having those sort of extreme highs and lows. And again, when it comes to help seeking, I asked specifically about barriers, and you can see there, he says that he thinks people will say that his mental health struggles are his fault because he's taken drugs, that was his choice, and that he's afraid people will tell him that he doesn't deserve help, so he doesn't want to ask for it. Which brings me to having a bit of a talk here about the issue of stigma, which comes back to that imagination exercise. Where do we get these stereotypes from? Why do we think these things? And then the next step is understanding how much it actually hurts people. So these quotes are directly from people who use drugs. They were shared with us. The Alcohol and Drug Foundation engaged in a project called The Power of Words that looked at the power of language and stigma and people's experience of stigma. And this is what some of the people we were involved with had to say. And I couldn't say it better. It stopped people from getting help, and it makes people internalize some of the terrible things that are said and represented about people who use drugs, or people who experience a dependence on drugs, or people who experience homelessness, people who experience mental illness or mental health problems. All of these stigmatized conditions, it just makes it so much more difficult for people to reach out and ask for that help when that condition is stigmatized. Which is why I wanted to now talk, after a whirlwind of a few people's stories, about what can we do about this. And one of the number one things, so stigma is a huge issue, but it's also one that we can all take action around. So we can all do things like using person-first language. Person-first language literally places someone's humanity front and center. They are a person who uses drugs. They are a person experiencing homelessness. So they are a person before they're anything else. And it really underscores that fundamental humanity. And it makes a big difference, not only to how other people feel when you speak to them, but when you start using person-first language, I know when I did, it's actually changed how I see the world. It's changed how I imagine the world and the people around me. And another thing that we can all do is to not repeat stigmatizing stereotypes or judgments. Now this is a twofold purpose. One is because recognizing the damage that stigma does, and the damage that anyone who's been stereotyped or judged for anything understands how painful it is. But also it means that, I mean, imagine if you were a person who was struggling with alcohol, for example, and you heard a friend of yours make a derogatory comment about people with an alcohol dependence, or they judged someone that they passed in the street. I know I wouldn't feel safe turning to that person and saying, hey, I actually am one of those people and I need help, I need support. That's not the friend I would turn to. So by not repeating those stigmatizing stereotypes or judgments, you can also set yourself up as someone who is safe, someone who's non-judgmental, someone who will listen, you know, that person that your loved ones can turn to. The other things that we talk about, and I have links to help out with all of these, because things like planning how to have a conversation is a whole, there's a lot of different points. I mean, that's almost a webinar in and of itself. And it's also very personal. It's something that we like to give people the information to then read and sit and have a think about it. Because a lot of that is thinking about when you're going to speak to someone, when's going to be a good time, thinking about exactly what sort of message you want to get across. You know, where do you want to go with this conversation? Doing things like using I statements. I'm worried, I care about you, I'm concerned because they can help somebody feel less defensive and less attacked and less judged. Also things like not just presenting or not just asking someone to recognize the issue, but also having their next steps, right? So that's the encourage help seeking and knowing where that person can go. So if you have a conversation with someone, say it's about their alcohol use, and they recognize with you like, oh yeah, you know what, I have been, I haven't really felt myself lately, it is having a negative impact on my life. And you can be there as the person who's like, great, I know where we can go for help. I know where I can take you. And also, I'm sure some of you might laugh at having to include this, but it is a sad thing that I've heard more often than you'd think, maintaining that person's privacy, especially with something like alcohol and other drugs. It does take a lot of trust and vulnerability for someone to confide in another person about an issue that can be so stigmatized. So then to hear that that person has told other friends or family members, even if their intentions were good, can really undermine that trust and actually do a lot of damage. Some of the other things that we recommend, though, in terms of what we can do, is respecting that people do have different views. Thinking back to what Tessa said about she doesn't want to give up alcohol entirely. She doesn't want to give up alcohol forever. Abstinence is not a desirable outcome for a lot of people. I think that's one of the myths about alcohol and drug use, is that abstinence is the only solution. And that's just not true for everyone. There's lots of different goals that people have. There's lots of different measures of success. So whilst abstinence is certainly what some people are working towards, it's not for everyone. And we do have to respect that person's agency and their right to make those sorts of decisions in their own life. That being said, you also need to have safe boundaries for yourself. And this one I think is critical. I mean, there could be an entire session on boundaries, but this is things like supporting other people is important, but you can't look after anybody if you're not looking after yourself, if you're not safe. No one should have to sacrifice their safety, health, and well-being in order to support another person. So we do recommend that people have a think about, if this is someone who does things that make you uncomfortable. For example, if they are drink driving, or if it's a partner or a friend that you share a home with and they come home intoxicated from alcohol or another drug, and they get really aggressive, or they make you feel uncomfortable. It's about drawing boundaries around things like, I love you and I care about you, but when you come home intoxicated, it makes me feel unsafe. And in order to look after myself, if that happens, I am going to go and stay at my sister's house or my friend's place. That's just, boundaries look different for everybody because it is based on personal safety, but they're really important, especially if there are some really negative or really toxic behaviors in that relationship. Boundaries are really about protecting yourself. And an organization like Family Drug Support, which is based in New South Wales, are awesome to speak to about that, because they have trained counselors that are there to support the family and friends of people who are struggling. And that's, again, that get support for yourself really is the other element there, is making sure that you have people that, you can talk to, whether it's a counselor or one of the counselors at Family Drug Support, to make sure that you're setting that time aside for self-care, to look after yourself. Because you can't take care of other people unless you take care of yourself first. So in terms of the services, there are fantastic services nationally and in New South Wales. And it's not just about alcohol and other drugs either, because oftentimes those problems can cross over with a lot of other issues. If we come back to things like setting boundaries, it might be setting boundaries with a partner or a child or a friend. And that can be really challenging, especially if it's something that, you're not used to doing or you've never had to do before. So there are organizations like Parent Line, New South Wales, it's all in the name, Family Relationship Advice Line, which can offer things like mediation service, Men's Line Australia, which specifically is there to support a range of needs of Australian men. And then you've probably heard of Beyond Blue and Headspace, for general mental health support, which can also be an element of helping to support somebody else. It might not just be about something like alcohol use, it might also be going through a depression. So talking to the support staff at Beyond Blue can also help you work out sort of a tailored, how can I help my friend? So with someone experiencing depression, for example, it might be, once a night I'm going to go over, or once a week I'm going to go over for a movie night, and we're just going to hang out. And I'm not going to expect them to be energetic or lively or bubbly. They might just want to, sit and be with somebody and, just have that bit of companionship. So again, reaching out to those sorts of organizations can really help you build that strategy for your specific situation, especially when there's crossover between alcohol and other drugs and mental health and relationship issues, as there quite often is. So what I want everyone to walk away with really is just thinking back to that issue of stigma, to those stereotypes, to think about people like Tessa saying she's afraid that people will think she's not good enough to be a mom, or that she would be a bad mother because she's had struggles with alcohol, or somebody like Billy saying he's afraid people will look at him and say, well, you know what, you have mental health issues because you chose to use drugs and you don't deserve help. That, I can't say it better than they've said in their own words. But I do want to reinforce that we can all work to address stigma. And, it is things like that, not repeating those stereotypes and using person-first language. On the list that we're going to send out, there's a site that I highly recommend called Lives of Substance that shares a whole range of different stories and different people's firsthand experience of using alcohol and other drugs, accessing treatment, their experiences of stigma. It really does illuminate the breadth of experience, how everyone's experience is different, how everyone uses alcohol or drugs for different reasons, and then also how everyone is just, at the end of the day, they're human beings. So I'd really recommend everyone checking out Lives of Substance if you're interested in hearing more of those sorts of firsthand accounts. And the other takeaway I want everyone to have is to know that help is literally a phone call away. And that's, help and support for you. That's counseling support for anyone who's struggling with alcohol and other drugs or mental health issues. And to never hesitate to reach out to those services. That's why they're here. That's why I've loved the work that I do. And really to share that resource that I've sent around, because the more people know that these services exist, the more people know what they do, then the more likely it is that somebody is going to know where to go and who to call when they really need that support.